La poesía.
Poetry.
La poesía, la música.
Poetry, music.
El texto espiritual más
Spiritual
informativo
text
es
is
el
more
canto de la
informative,
tierra.
is the song of the
Hay que
earth.
escucharlo.
You've got to listen to it.
Que falta la pintura.
And then painting.
I did not dance enough yesterday because we went to take tapas. Do you know what tapas means in English? There are plenty of alternatives. Are you ready for the alternatives? Yeah. Are you ready for a better trade system? Are you ready to engage for rewriting the rules of the game of the current trade system? No? Are you really ready? Yeah. Many of you have already done the first step. Millions of us have already demonstrated against the current trade rules in the World Trade Organization, in bilateral trade and investment treaties. In Berlin, 300,000 demonstrators filled the streets and protested against TTIP, the trade agreement with the United States and the European Union, CETA, the same with Canada. I myself have been, amongst others, in 2003 in Cancun, Mexico, where thousands, tens of thousands of demonstrators demonstrated against the World Trade Organization, and the biggest sectors of demonstrators were farmers from Mexico, corn farmers, and rice farmers from South Korea. And they demonstrated against free trade because it takes away their livelihood. So, are those who criticize free trade protectionists, or even friends of Mr. Trump? That's the debate today. Are you for or against free trade? And if you're against free trade, you're a protectionist. These are both extremes, and none of them does make really sense if you think it thoroughly. What does free trade mean in the end? It means the more trade, always the better. Trade becomes an end in itself, no matter if we violate human rights or respect them, if we accelerate climate change or slow it down, if we protect cultural diversity or destroy it. That's nonsensical. The same with protectionism. Protection is good, but if protection becomes an end in itself, that would mean that the more protection, the better, until we close down everything, and I think that's identically nonsensical as free trade in the described meaning. So why are we totally obsessed with two terms that are both absurd in the end? Maybe to distract our minds from alternatives that are more meaningful in between. And one of these alternatives could be ethical trade, which I would define by trade is not an end in itself, it's not bad either, it's a tool. It's an instrument that serves higher goals. And that means that we have to take a more closer look on the goals that we actually want to achieve. Human rights, sustainable development, social cohesion, just distribution, cultural diversity, gender equality. These are the goals and values that trade should serve. If trade serves these goals, we like it, and we allow more trade. But if trade endangers these goals, which is actually in the same way possible, then we don't like it, and we need more protection against trade. But in both cases, we stay relaxed, because trade is not an end in itself, it's just an instrument that helps us to serve and to fulfill and achieve our goals. Now, what's the state of the art today? In the fundamental treaty of the European Union, does the European Union choose the middle way, say this is an extreme, this is an extreme? No, the European Union says we go for this extreme. And the less trade barriers, the better. And it's even said twice in the Lisbon Treaty, if you take an exact look, because to mention it only once would not be enough. We have to repeat it in a very small paragraph, which is the mandate, the constitutional mandate for the trade policy of the European Union. So, if we protested, for instance, against TTIP, the trade agreement between the United States and the European Union, and we should succeed in preventing this treaty to be concluded, well, we will not have achieved a lot, because the constitutional mandate to conclude more trade agreements, both on the multilateral level as well as on the bilateral level, will be continued. It's the constitutional, the treaty mandate of the European Commission to start one after the other trade agreement until the last trade barrier, and you know that everything can be a trade barrier, is eliminated. Only then the treaty is fulfilled. So what we could or should fight against is this Article 206 in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which is the wrong mandate for all trade and investment agreements on all levels. And just to give you a small example, the World Trade Organization is international law, it's binding international law, and it's enforceable international law in 60 treaties. And because this is an extreme policy approach, free trade is an extreme, there is a stalemate. There is no progress ongoing in the World Trade Organization, and that's why in 2007, the European Commission switched its strategy, its foreign trade strategy on the bilateral level, and is at this moment negotiating 40 trade agreements, not only with the United States and with Canada, but with many other countries, with the extreme approach, with the goal to eliminate all barriers to trade. And 3,500 of those treaties have already been concluded between one state and another. And this international law is enforceable. So the tribunals of this planet will judge in favor of free trade because this is binding international law. And this, I think, we should change. We should not allow economic means like trade and investment to become not only fundamental rights, but international super fundamental rights. How can we recognize that they are super fundamental rights? Because they are enforceable. Other than human rights, if they are violated by transnational corporations, other than labor standards, they are not enforceable, other than environmental protection agreements, other than climate protection agreements, protection of cultural diversity, a reasonable equality. None of these higher goals are enforceable on the international level. Free trade and investments are, and their protection, they are on the international level enforceable. And here you see the growing number of lawsuits that have been filed from state to another state, members of the World Trade Organization, or that's the new trend, directly from transnational corporations, we call them investors, against states, if states do their democratic duty and regulate to protect the environment, consumers, citizens, the health, local economies, or other reasonable policy goals that are more important than trade, investment, or any other economic instrument. So, what's the possible alternative? I propose a brainstorming of 6 approaches. First approach, let's go back to the multilateral level, but not to the World Trade Organization, because it's outside the United Nations, with its human rights approach, with its environmental protection and climate protection approach, with its approach for food sovereignty, for cultural diversity, for gender equality, and other reasonable and legitimate policy goals. Let's go back to the United Nations and create an ethical trade zone there, and let's protect through enforceable international law against those who do not respect human rights, labor standards, environmental agreements, climate protection agreements, cultural diversity, and the like, and put higher tariffs against those countries who do not join the policy goals that people all over the world share. Or, in other words, freer trade for those countries who respect human rights and who really engage for a sustainable development and less freer trade, protection with tariffs or other instruments against those countries that do not respect all those legitimate and higher policy goals. Just one example for those who are now a bit confused. The European Union's strategy is to make a priority trade agreement with the United States, but the United States, before Trump, the United States with Obama, had not ratified the second Human Rights Covenant, and out of the 8 core labor standards of the International Labour Organization, they only had ratified 2, and they had not ratified 6. So why would the European Union, that is so much engaged with democracy and human rights, conclude a prioritarian trade agreement with a country that does not respect human rights, labor standards, which are also regarded as part of human rights in international law, and many other agreements from climate protection to cultural diversity. A coherent trade strategy and external trade policy would be, we offer same rules to all countries, and those countries that really respect human rights and labor standards and environmental protection and climate protection and subject themselves to international courts that enforce these policy goals instead of economic means, well, with those countries we will trade freer, no matter who it is. So it's an open approach, and we can start it within the United Nations. And if you think that 193 nations would have to agree upon this proposal of the European Union, the good message is that's not necessary. The International Criminal Court that started its work a few years ago was only agreed by 60 nations, not by 193. And an even better example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which gave birth to the 2 human rights covenants. The 2 human rights covenants, the Civil Covenant and the Social Covenant, they entered into force with only 35 signatures. So we have good examples that it's enough to have 35 countries who start an ethical trade zone within the United Nations and invite everybody else to join the ethical trade zone. A second principle could be that poorer countries don't have to open up their borders in the same speed as richer countries. And we have a very strong argument for that. In history, there is no single example of a country that became a rich country thanks to free trade. No single example. All rich country and wealthy nations today became wealthy thanks to protectionism. We learn from historians that the United States, again, was the mother country of protectionism, but they didn't invent it. They learned it from another country. They learned it from United Kingdom. That's why I call the United Kingdom and Great Britain the grandmother country of protectionism. And the point is, we should give the same right to other countries that had not the opportunity up to today. The next point is very similar. I'm for freedom. And I would not like to force any country. You have to open up, and you have to allow, and you have to enforce trade, and you have to welcome investment, and you have to renounce to your right to regulate investment in order for sustainable development. I think that's the approach of a straitjacket. Maybe you've heard this term. It's not from me. It's from Thomas Friedman, not Milton Friedman, but Thomas Friedman. He was already referred to yesterday. And he quoted the Indonesian government, and the Indonesian government that had just suffered a so-called structural adjustment program by the International Monetary Fund. They said, well, it feels like a straitjacket. You know, privatization, liberalization, deregulation, austerity, a cut in social expenditure and the like. And Thomas Friedman did not criticize it, he liked it. And he said, well, it might feel like a straitjacket, but you have to see, you have to understand, it's a golden straitjacket, in the words of Thomas Friedman. And we know that it's not true, that straitjackets always take away your freedom, and in no single case they're a good idea. And that's why the proposal is not to use straitjacket at all, but to use dance stresses, which means every country is allowed to be as open or close as it likes to be. That's its sovereign freedom. And why should we impose any country in a multilateral trade system? You have to do this and you have to be that open, or you must not be closer than other countries. That's an approach against freedom. And of course, every country can say and is allowed to apply its regional policy, its labor market policy, its development policy, its technology policy, and it's allowed. In the current trade, enforced trade system, it's not allowed, and countries that are going their own way, they can brought before court because of violation of free trade rules. Yeah, I already said that localization is not an end in itself. I think the message, the more local the better, is not the point, but almost. In most of all decisions, if we ponder, should we shape the economy more globally or more locally, in most of all these ponderations, the local will be the winner. But still, it's not an end in itself, and the term which I like most is economic subsidiarity, which means everything what we can do at the local scale, we should give priority to be done there. But some things which we cannot do reasonably on the local level, we can do on the higher scale. And something, and maybe not only the spices, can come from the global level. So it's a cooperation of all levels, but with priority to the local sphere. Not only for ecological reasons, also for the reason of good relationships, of fulfilling relationships, and of democratic control of the economy. Well, if we vote for the latter two, for 3 and 4, if every country enjoys the freedom to shape its policies as it likes, then it could happen that one country chooses to go for a large export superávit and to import less, like, for instance, Germany. And of course, this would bring out of balance the global trade regime, and that's why a precondition to be part of an ethical trade regime is the obligation to have a balanced trade balance. This means you can protect whatever you want to protect, but you cannot do it at the cost of your trade partners. And that would be a way backwards into mercantilism. And the last point would be, we propose a size limit for economic actors, for instance, companies, because if they become too big and powerful, they're not only too big to fail, but they're also too big to jail, you know. They're just politically too powerful, and that's why another precondition for accessing world markets should be you have to remain small, as simple as that. And you have to do a common good balance sheet. And only if you do good to the environment and the people, which is the motto of NESI, only if you prove that you're not harming the people and the planet, only then your license to trade is prolonged, is continued. And this idea is already a practice of so far 400 companies that have done a common good balance sheet, just to mention that it's already implemented. So the remaining question is, if you like this or a similar set of a different trade system, how do we get it into the Lisbon Treaty? That's the question at stake. Because even if we prevent TTIP from being concluded, we will not have changed yet the mandate for extreme free trade in the Lisbon Treaty. But who would not like to have it replaced by, for instance, this formula, which goes for human rights and environment and all our fundamental values? And the offer or the invitation I have brought for you is sovereign democracy. Sovereign democracy can be understood literally. Sovereignty is a core principle of democracy, and it comes from the Latin word superanus. and superanus means literally to stand above all. And in democracies, we know that that body that stands above all are the citizens. But you know this, but have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt this, that you are above all? If we really stood above all, if the sovereignty was a real principle in our democracies, then we could change the constitution. And we could give a different mandate, not only to the government, but also to the parliament. And we could rewrite the game rules of international law. And that's what we propose. We do not propose to assemble in Brussels or in Strasbourg. We propose that you can assemble in your local communities, in your family even, but maybe in your municipality, and talk about the 10 to 20 fundamental rules of the game of the international trade system you want. And don't talk about details, talk about the most fundamental questions. And the first and foremost question is, do we want to enforce free trade until the last trade barrier is eliminated? Do we want to go for protectionism until trade is killed? Or do we want to go for ethical trade, where trade is just a means? The result is, if the people could decide on the fundamental rules of the trade system, and one of these questions would be this choice, and the point is that the procedure that we did not invent, but we implement successfully, systemic consensus, it allows to choose, like with tapas, at least 2 alternatives. Yeah, but the more, not the more the better, but better 4 or 5 or 6. We could add mercantilism, for instance. We could add planned economy, for instance. You see, there are more alternatives. And then we do not measure the affirmation. Yes, I go for this, because then Trump or Berlusconi or Bush could buy a PR agency and make a propaganda tour, and then the billionaires will be the winner. No, we measure the resistance against every proposal. Raising no arm, 1 arm or 2 arm, or raising 0 fingers or up to 10 fingers, points of resistance. And the winner is that proposal that meets the least resistance. This is the most empathical procedure I've ever known, because if one proposal still overlooks a need, a value, or a minority, somebody can make an even better proposal that is including that minority. And the result is, and this result is from the Vienna University for Economics and Business Administration, students of business administration. And I guessed for sure they would give some respect to ethical trade, but of course free trade will be the winner. And you see that free trade is almost as much a loser as protectionism, and there is no resistance at all against an alternative which we could more in detail shape together in those local democratic assemblies. And my final invitation is, again, try it out. The paper is there, the procedure is there. You can start in your peer group, and maybe the highest goal for the moment is to do it in your hometown or community or municipality. Thanks a lot for your attention.